May 8th, 1945. The Rhine Valley. The war in Europe had ended just hours before, but the dust had not yet settled. In a requisitioned textile mill on the outskirts of Mannheim, 317 German women sat in silence. They were not wives waiting for husbands. They were not refugees fleeing the rubble. They were prisoners of war, auxiliary personnel, radio operators, anti-aircraft gunners, clerks who had typed orders that sent men to die. They had worn the uniform of the Wehrmacht, and now they wore the gray pallor of defeat. The mill smelled of machine oil and old wool, and through its high windows, the late afternoon sun cut the air into slanted gold bars that fell across rows of wooden benches. The women did not speak. They waited. For what, they did not know. In the Reich they had served, waiting always preceded something terrible. Outside, the rumble of diesel engines grew louder. American trucks. The women stiffened. They had been told stories, whispered in bunkers, passed from mouth to mouth in the final weeks as the Reich collapsed like a house of cards set aflame. The Amos were beasts, undisciplined, drunk on victory. They would come for the women first. That is what always happened when armies broke through. That is what had happened in the East. The women of Berlin had learned this. The women of Silesia had learned this. Now was their turn. Some of them were 19. Some were 42. All of them knew what happened to women when men with guns decided the rules no longer applied. But what they did not know, what they could not yet fathom, was that the men approaching them had been raised in a country where doors were held open for women, where mothers were honored on the second Sunday of May, where even a farmhand knew to remove his hat indoors. The collision of these two worlds, one built on absolute obedience and the other on casual civility, would leave a mark deeper than any interrogation. The doors opened, not kicked in, not forced, opened, and the first American soldier stepped inside, removed his helmet, and said in broken German, "Good evening, ladies." The women did not move. They barely breathed. To understand the shock that rippled through that room, one must first understand what these women had been taught to expect. The Third Reich had constructed a cosmology of enemies, a mythology in which the Americans occupied a strange and contradictory space. They were, according to Goebbels' propaganda machine, both laughably weak and existentially dangerous. They were mongrels, a racially deluded nation of jazz-playing capitalists who could not fight a real war. Yet they were also the architects of total war, the bombers who incinerated cities from the sky, the engineers of industrial slaughter. German women serving in auxiliary roles had absorbed these narratives not as propaganda, but as fact. They had seen the bombers. They had pulled bodies from the rubble of Hamburg, of Dresden, of Cologne. They had no reason to believe that the men who dropped those bombs would show them mercy on the ground. And there was another layer beneath the propaganda: experience. Many of these women had brothers, fathers, husbands who had fought on the Eastern Front. They had heard the stories. The Red Army's advance into East Prussia in January 1945 had become a symphony of atrocity. German civilians fleeing westward carried tales of villages burned, of women assaulted in front of their children, of old men shot in ditches. Soviet reprisal was not hidden. It was declared. Ilya Ehrenburg, the Soviet journalist, had written, "Kill the German wherever you find him." The message was clear. War was a license, and defeat was a sentence. So when the American trucks arrived that May evening, the women in the Mannheim mill expected the worst. They had been conditioned to expect it. The grammar of total war allowed no other outcome. But the Americans who entered that mill had been conditioned by an entirely different grammar. The United States military in 1945 was not a perfect institution. It was segregated. It carried the prejudices of the society that built it. But it was also bound by a legal and moral framework that Nazi Germany had abandoned in 1933. The Geneva Conventions were not abstract theory to the American command. They were policy. General Dwight Eisenhower had issued explicit directives regarding the treatment of POWs, and those directives were enforced not through fear, but through a belief, however imperfectly realized, that the rules mattered. American soldiers were told that even the enemy had rights. Even the defeated had dignity. This was not softness. It was doctrine. And beneath the doctrine was culture. Most American GIs in 1945 had been raised in homes where certain behaviors were simply expected. You did not strike a woman. You did not humiliate the helpless. You held doors. You said please and thank you. These were not grand moral proclamations. They were manners, the invisible architecture of a society that believed, rightly or wrongly, that civility was a mark of civilization. To the German women, these gestures would seem incomprehensible. To the Americans, they were reflexive. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, the officer in charge of processing the female POWs at Mannheim, would later recall in his 1978 memoir that he had been more nervous about the logistics than the prisoners. We didn't have proper facilities for women, he wrote. We didn't have female guards. We had to commandeer a separate building, arrange for medical staff, figure out food. I wasn't worried about them hurting us. I was worried about doing it wrong. This concern that the occupiers might fail in their duty of care was alien to the women waiting inside. The first gesture came within minutes. A sergeant, a man named Eugene Kowalski from Pittsburgh, noticed that the benches were too close together. The women were crammed shoulder to shoulder. He motioned to his men, and they began moving the benches, creating aisles. One of the German women, a former Luftwaffe radio operator named Greta Mensing, would later describe her confusion. They were making space for us. I thought they were preparing for something else. I thought they needed room to do what soldiers do. But then they just stepped back. They stepped back and waited. I did not understand. Then came the doors. The mill had once been partitioned into separate workrooms, and the interior doors had been left in place. As the women were directed to move into smaller groups for processing, the American soldiers opened each door and waited. Held it. Let the women pass through first. Greta Mensing froze at the threshold. The soldier holding the door, a boy, really no older than 20, looked at her and nodded. Go ahead, ma'am, he said. Ma'am. Not prisoner. Not you. Ma'am. She walked through. Behind her, another woman began to cry. This was not an isolated incident. Across occupied Germany in the spring and summer of 1945, similar scenes unfolded in dozens of POW camps. The American treatment of German female prisoners became, in the words of historian Atina Grossman, a source of profound cognitive dissonance. These women had been taught that Americans were barbaric. They had been told that surrender meant suffering. Instead, they found themselves in camps where the latrines were clean, where the food, though plain, was sufficient, where guards did not shout unless there was a reason to shout. And the doors. Always the doors. In a displaced persons camp near Frankfurt, a former nurse named Ilse Probst noticed that American soldiers would knock before entering a room, even when that room was a converted barracks housing 30 women. They knocked, she wrote in a letter to her sister in 1946, as if we were guests, as if we had not lost the war. In another camp near Stuttgart, a young woman named Anneliese Huber asked an American guard why he opened doors for prisoners. The guard, a corporal from Ohio, looked confused by the question. Because you're carrying something, he said. She had been holding a single blanket. The small gestures accumulated. They formed a pattern. And the pattern forced a question that the women could not ignore. What kind of country raises men like this? The food became the second symbol. In the Mannheim mill, the evening of May 8th, the American quartermaster staff served the German women their first meal as POWs. It was not elaborate. Bread, canned beans, coffee, and improbably chocolate bars. K-ration dessert components, distributed without ceremony. But to women who had spent the final months of the war on rations of black bread and potato soup, who had watched their nation's food supply collapse under the weight of blockade and strategic bombing, the meal was surreal. Greta Mensing, the radio operator, unwrapped her chocolate bar slowly. She had not seen real chocolate since 1942. She took a small bite and closed her eyes. Later, she would write, I thought it was a trick. I thought they were feeding us well before the interrogation. So we would talk. But there was no interrogation. There was only a sergeant who came by and asked if we needed more coffee. The abundance was not incidental. It was structural. The United States had entered the war as the world's largest economy, and it had mobilized that economy with ruthless efficiency. By 1945, American industrial output exceeded that of all Axis powers combined. The nation produced enough food to feed not only its own troops, but also millions of liberated Europeans and millions of captured enemies. This was not generosity in the sentimental sense. It was policy. But to the German women, the distinction did not matter. What mattered was the chocolate. What mattered was the coffee that was actually coffee, not roasted grain. What mattered was that no one took the food away. In the weeks that followed, as the women were processed and transferred to longer-term camps, the meals continued. Meat appeared. Vegetables. Milk. The American Red Cross distributed care packages. The women gained weight. Their skin lost its gray tinge. And with the return of physical health came something more dangerous, the return of thought. The interrogations, when they came, were nothing like what the women had imagined. There were no beatings, no sleep deprivation, no threats against family. Instead, there were interviews. American intelligence officers, often accompanied by translators, sat across tables and asked questions. They took notes. They cross-referenced information. They were methodical, not cruel. Ilse Probst, the nurse, was questioned about the field hospital where she had worked. The American officer wanted to know about supply lines, about medical protocols, about the treatment of wounded Soviet prisoners. She answered truthfully, expecting punishment. Instead, the officer thanked her. "That's very helpful," he said. Then he asked if she needed anything. She said no. He left a pack of cigarettes on the table anyway. This pattern repeated across hundreds of interrogations. The Americans were gathering intelligence, yes, but they were doing so within boundaries that the women had never seen before. There were rules. There were limits. And when the women realized that the limits were real, that they were not a prelude to worse things, something inside them began to shift. Anneliese Huber, the young woman who had asked about the doors, would later describe the feeling. It was like waking from a nightmare and discovering that the nightmare was not the present but the past. I had believed that all soldiers were the same. That war made everyone into beasts. But these men were not beasts. They were boys who missed their mothers. They showed us photographs of their families. They asked about ours. I began to wonder if we had been lied to about more than just the war. The symbolic object that defined this transformation was not a weapon. It was a key. In the longer-term POW camps, the American administration began to implement what they called self-governance protocols. The women were allowed to elect representatives. They were given keys to storage rooms, to supply closets, to their own barracks. They were trusted, within limits, to manage their own affairs. This was revolutionary. In the Reich, authority had flowed downward always. Orders were given, never negotiated. Obedience was absolute. The idea that prisoners, female prisoners, defeated enemies, could hold keys, could make decisions, could govern even the smallest aspects of their lives, was incomprehensible. But the keys were real, and the women used them. In a camp near Heidelberg, the POWs organized a rotating cleaning schedule. They established a library using donated books. They created a choir. The American guards did not interfere unless safety was at issue. They observed, they supervised, but they did not micromanage. And in that space, that unexpected margin of autonomy, the women began to rebuild something that the war had taken from them: agency. Greta Mincing would write, years later, "The key to the storage room was a small thing, but it was the first time in 5 years that I had been trusted with anything. In the Wehrmacht, I had operated radios that coordinated anti-aircraft batteries. I had been responsible for machines worth thousands of Reichsmarks. But I had never been trusted. I had been supervised, monitored, controlled. The Americans gave me a key to a room full of mops and brooms, and I felt for the first time since 1940 like a human being. Not all the women responded the same way. Some remained defiant, loyal to the ideology that had collapsed around them. They saw American kindness as weakness, as proof that the Reich had been right about the mongrel democracies. These women were a minority, but they were vocal. They sang Nazi songs in the barracks. They refused to cooperate with self-governance. They clung to the identity they had built during the war, because without it, they were nothing. But most of the women did not cling. They adapted. They watched. They learned. And slowly, they began to ask questions that the Reich had forbidden. Why did the Americans feed their prisoners so well? Why did they care about hygiene, about medical care, about mental health? Why did they allow elections, even in a POW camp? Why did they treat women with a respect that even the Wehrmacht had not always shown its own female auxiliaries? The answers to these questions were not simple, and the women did not arrive at them quickly. But the process of asking, the mere fact that asking was possible, was itself a form of liberation. The epilogue to this story is not a single moment, but 1,000 small ones scattered across years. Greta Mincing returned to Berlin in 1946. She found her city in ruins and her family scattered. But she carried with her a memory, a sergeant from Pittsburgh, moving benches to give women space to breathe. She carried a chocolate bar wrapper, folded carefully, kept in a Bible. She carried a key. In 1949, she emigrated to the United States. She became a citizen in 1955. She raised 2 children in Philadelphia. She never forgot what she had expected that May evening in the Mannheim Mill, and she never stopped being grateful that she had been wrong. Ilse Probst did not emigrate, but she became a teacher in Hamburg. She taught her students about the war, about the Reich, about the cost of absolute obedience. And she taught them about the American soldiers who had knocked before entering. Civility, she would say, is not weakness, is the foundation of everything else. Anneliese Huber married an American soldier in 1947. They settled in Iowa. She wrote a memoir in the 1980s, published in German, titled The Door. In it, she described the moment when a young corporal from Ohio had waited, helmet in hand, for her to pass through a doorway. In that moment, she wrote, I understood that freedom is not the absence of rules. It is the presence of rules that recognize your humanity. The women who were stunned by open doors carried that stunned feeling for the rest of their lives. It was not a simple gratitude. It was something more complex, a recognition that the world they had believed in, the world of absolute power, of racial destiny, of glory through conquest, had been a lie. And the proof of that lie was not a grand philosophical argument. It was a door held open. It was a chocolate bar given freely. It was a key offered without suspicion. The Reich had told them that strength meant dominance, that victory meant the subjugation of the weak. But the Americans, in victory, had shown them something else. They had shown them that a strong nation could afford to be kind, that a victorious army could afford to be decent, that the rules, those invisible, fragile rules that govern how human beings treat one another, mattered most when they were hardest to follow. This was the lesson that no propaganda could undo, no ideology could erase. It was learned not through speeches or manifestos, but through the accumulated weight of small gestures. A door, a key, a cup of coffee, a sergeant who said, ma'am. And in the end, those small gestures toppled more than walls. They toppled certainties. They toppled the belief that the world was a simple place, where the strong devoured the weak and mercy was a fairy tale. They proved that even in the aftermath of the most brutal war in human history, there was space for something other than vengeance. There was space for a door held open, for a woman walking through, for a guard who waited. And in that space, fragile and brief, was the possibility of a different world. A world where the defeated were not destroyed, but fed. Where the enemy was not annihilated, but processed, questioned, and eventually released. Where the end of war was not the beginning of chaos, but the tentative, uncertain start of something that might, one day, be called peace. The women who experienced this, who lived through the cognitive dissonance of expecting brutality and receiving bureaucracy, of expecting humiliation and receiving courtesy, carried forward a truth that the Reich had tried to bury. They carried it in their memories, in their letters, in the stories they told their children. They carried it in the chocolate bar wrappers they saved, in the keys they kept as talismans, in the way they paused, decades later, when someone held a door. They carried the proof that civilization, however fragile, however imperfect, was not a myth. It was a choice. 1,000 small choices made by tired soldiers who could have chosen otherwise. And that choice, multiplied across 1,000 moments in 100 camps, became the foundation of something larger. It became the answer to the question the women had not known they were asking. What comes after the end of everything? The answer was a door opening. The answer was a voice saying, "Go ahead, ma'am." The answer was the possibility that even in the darkest hour, even in the shadow of total war, humanity could persist. Not as a grand abstraction, not as a philosophical ideal, but as a sergeant from Pittsburgh rearranging benches so women could sit in comfort. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. That was the moment when German women, POWs, stunned and silent, walked through an open door and found, on the other side, a future they had not imagined possible.